Okay, great. So we can go ahead.
Okay. Hello, I'm Poonam. I'm a library assistant here at Woolwich Centre Library. To help us explore some of the themes of Black History Month, I'm joined today by yoga teacher and sound healer, Kallie Shu. Hi, Kallie. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be speaking to you and speaking to Greenwich Libraries.
So I wanted to start off by asking you just to tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
So my name is Kallie Scott. I actually work in Greenwich. I used to work for Greenwich Libraries many years ago, and I currently work in children's services. So I'm a local resident, and I work hard to support our local community. I became a yoga teacher a few years ago. I'm Indian by heritage, and so I've always grown up practicing yoga. And when I started going into yoga spaces, I recognized that there was issues around cultural appropriation, and it felt that people's race and heritage and culture wasn't being recognized and celebrated in those spaces. So I founded my own yoga teaching company, Rebel Yoga Tribe. I deliver regular classes. I have a YouTube channel now, and I run anti-racist and racial equity courses in the yoga industry. And I'm also a founder of the Yoga Teachers Union, which is a part of the IWGB union. So I'm really active in this industry in bringing equity to the practice and in challenging racial discrimination within this practice.
That sounds amazing. As somebody myself who enjoys getting on the mat in the morning to practice this simple form of self-care, essentially, after looking at your work on Instagram, on your website, I realised that there is a completely different way of looking at yoga that I'd never considered before. And yet I couldn't argue with the facts that when I searched for a yoga teacher online, the top 10 would be white, have lots of trendy gear. And I wondered if perhaps we are losing some of the essence of yoga.
So like you, Poonam, I had the same experience, even though I grew up with a home practice of yoga, so very much rooted in South Asian heritage, culture and traditions. When I started searching for a community or public class to attend, all I could find was classes that were delivered by essentially white women who had come to the practice later on in life, who'd done a 200 hours training, and it seemed to be a lifestyle choice as opposed to a healing practice, and a practice that was welcoming and inclusive of everyone, you know, taking into account people's skin color, their race, their ethnicity, their disabilities or abilities, their body size, their kind of, you know, sexual and gender orientation and expressions. It seemed to be a very exclusive space that only reached out to white women and women with money. And therefore, this practice that is rooted in a wisdom tradition from India, and a practice that is for healing and for connection and spiritual journey, was excluding the very groups that would benefit most from the health benefits of this practice, but also the sense of community and all of the wonderful things that yoga brings to our essence, to our being. And Absolutely. So that's what drove me very much to create a space that was much more inclusive, you know, a space that welcomed everybody, especially those who are marginalised and excluded from these spaces in the mainstream.
And when you experienced these inequalities when you first started out yoga, or even throughout your yoga practices, did you find that you experienced these things more here in the UK? Did you have some yoga experiences in India that you could tell us a bit more about, and how they were different from here?
So when I attended classes here, I went to studios and community centres. And I tried quite a few different classes, and again it was much of the sameness. There was very little diversity, there was very little inclusion. I would often be the only brown person in the space. There were very rarely any black people in the spaces, so it was mostly a very exclusive white space. When I went to do my training, I went to India to do my training at an ashram with a group.
Yeah.
And what I found there, and you'll be surprised, I was surprised because I'd expected all of the students on the yoga teacher training course to be Indian or Asian heritage because it's in India, right? But most of the students were white people from Europe, from Australia, from Canada, from America, from England. And therefore, what I found was that the teaching was all designed by white women, delivered for white women.
Yeah, it's sad that like you couldn't get the authentic experience even in like the home country where it began.
And that's what, and that made me very curious to understand why it was that even when I went back to the place in which this tradition was rooted, even then the yoga that was being taught and shared was designed for the Western appetite, for Western interest. It's what appealed to the Western audience and Western yoga teachers and students. So therefore, I kind of wanted to explore this in more depth, and that's why I then kind of embarked on this journey at looking at what were the influences and impacts on yoga that's changed the practice from what I knew at home and what many South Asian people practice at home. What happened to that practice? How has it changed? And what were the influences? And that's where much of my now anti-racist work has really grown out of that inquiry, that curiosity.
And also, you mentioned before in our earlier chat that like some of the structural racism goes back way into like the days of the Raj, British Raj, during colonialism. How do you think that has, or do you think that has filtered into the yoga of today?
So when what I found was that the yoga that was being taught, when it was even referenced as being a wisdom tradition from India, what teachers would often say, white teachers, was, oh, this is 5,000 years old. And so they would go back in time and look at those very early times when yoga began to be codified. What they skip out and what they very rarely acknowledge, recognize, or refer to is the 400 years of colonialism that impacted on India and how that shaped the practice. And those are the most recent years. So if we skip over and erase a whole period of history that had a hugely traumatizing impact on colonized people, not only in India, we know that the European imperialism and expansionism affected, by 1900, 75% of the world was under European rule in some way or another. So we had obviously the devastating impact on Africa and on the extraction of people as resource from Africa to the Americas in order to work on the plantations there. People were dehumanized and subhumanized by Europeans, by the British, so that they could be treated as chattel, as property, in order to generate income, profit, and wealth. And so this very much, this colonial imperialism, this expansionism into India came with the very same principles of extracting resource and wealth and people from India. I'm talking about pre-partition India. And in that extraction, wisdom traditions were also extracted. And the lens on which Europeans look at Indian wisdom traditions, is very much through a Eurocentric viewpoint of exploitation rather than honoring and respecting and valuing. And so what I wanted to explore was what did the period of colonialism do to the practice of yoga? What impact did it have on the people who were colonized in terms of the trauma, the suppression, and the oppressive impact on them? And then to look at the legacy of yoga through this post-colonial lens. And when I began to look at yoga in that way, I could see how the seeds of racism, which were planted during the colonial period, are very much alive in our modern society, but also in the modern practice of yoga. And so we cannot look at yoga as separate from what's happening within our society.
Yeah,
and this has really been crystallized with Black Lives Matter over this past period. And now I think people are beginning to wake up to the fact that there is systemic racism in our countries in the West, in which Black and brown bodies are dehumanized or subhumanized, and in ways that they are not Black and brown people don't have access to the same privilege, the same pathway through life. The lives of Black and brown people are much harder to traverse. And it's the same in the yoga industry. It's not immune to the impact of racism. It's not immune to the impact of these concepts of white people are superior and Black and brown people are inferior.
As you explain this so elegantly, you kind of really highlight that it's a fascinating subject, but it's also a serious problem. So how do we begin to break these walls down? How do we begin to question these structures of inequality, and potentially how do we change? How do we increase awareness and change the things that we're experiencing and seeing in our world today?
So one of the things I think we need to do first, Poonam, is really begin to recognize the systems and structures that exist. Because once we can begin to take a critical view and this lens that we have, so think about, we are all conditioned by the culture in which we are raised. So if we are raised in a culture and community that is dominantly white, and all of the media, all of the images we see, all of the language that we hear, the education that we receive, the politics that we are engaged in, when all of it is centered around whiteness, thinking about how that impacts on you if you are Black or brown, you know that you are not valued, you know that you are not central, you know that you are on the peripheries, you know that your voice is not heard, your body is not seen, your views are not recognized and represented. So when you begin to feel that experience within yourself, we adopt what we call internalized racism. We begin to believe these messages that we are less worthy, we are less than, because we don't see our representations of ourselves. We don't see the mirror of ourselves. We don't see the role models celebrated in the same way. And so we internalize this belief that we are inferior. And this can have an impact on our mental health. It can have an impact on our physical health. It causes us stress. So we all understand about epigenetics, when we are predisposed to particular conditions, when we are under stress. So when we look at what's happening as a result of COVID-19, for example, and no BAME communities are at greater risk of serious illness and are greater risk of death, we begin to understand the health inequalities that are structural in our society. And those health inequalities are based on economic inequalities, because Black and brown people generally are working frontline jobs, are working 0-hour contracts, are often having insecure income. So they have no choice but to work, and they may not have access to schemes that are available to them. So that begins to connect our health with the economic inequities that exist. So that's the first thing to begin to really observe. And then we know how the greater numbers of Black people and Asian people, so Asian and Black youth, are at greater risk of being stopped and searched. We know about the rise of Islamophobia and the impact that has. So there's a lot that's going on for Black and brown people. They have to juggle. So that initially, and that adds to the stress we deal with. So it makes us more vulnerable.
And Black and Asian people are dying disproportionately during COVID as well.
they're disproportionately, there's disproportionate impact of health inequalities on Black and brown people. There's a disproportionate number of Black and brown people who are in prison or stopped or arrested. There's a disproportionate number of people in terms of their representation in leadership and management posts in all organizations. There's not only a gender pay gap, we hear a lot about the gender pay gap, but there's also an ethnic pay gap, that Black and brown people get paid generally less on average than white people. So this inequity is across the board. So yoga, and my point has always been, yoga is not exceptional. What happens with yoga spaces and yoga teachers, because it's all kind of a spiritual, feel-good practice, it's about enlightenment and seeing everybody as one. We all have one soul, we are all the same, we are all one human race. What that fails to do is recognize the structural inequities that impact on Black and brown bodies. So therefore, if they're on lower pay, how can we afford to pay higher membership fees to yoga studios? How can we pay? Yoga classes on average are £10, £15. That's a lot. That's above the national living wage. So that's not going to be accessible to many people, not only Black and brown people, but working class people, people who are on low incomes, families that are having to have multiple jobs in order to pay the bill and still living in poverty. So those, you can't shy away from, if you look in your yoga space and you say, oh, there aren't very many Black and brown people in this space, or you think, actually, I don't have, I seem to have just middle-class, well-educated professionals in my yoga space. Ask yourself why. Look at who's in the room and then look at who's not in the room. And when you begin to question who's not in the room, that's when you begin to realize why, and then you question that, and then you can take actions.
Okay, I'm not sure what that is. What do you mean? Okay, I don't need to ask. Can I do it from here?
So while you're having a think there, Poonam, the other thing that I really want to talk about is when we think about the trauma that's inherited. So in terms of the lived reality of most Black and brown people is racism. It may be overt, but mostly it's covert. So we have a lived daily reality of racism. We also have an inherited trauma. So people from South Asia, for example, my family, the Punjab was partitioned. So we have during the partition, so after British rule, so the way that the British managed to rule over India, over 350 million during the colonial age, is because they were able to align themselves with powerful people in India. So they aligned themselves with princes, they formed alliances with those who belonged to the higher caste. And so those powerful alliances meant that everybody else who was of a different caste, lower caste, people who were of different religions, began to be marginalised, be excluded. And their religions, their faiths, their wisdom practices were suppressed. And in terms of the British, when they finally left in 1947, after the Quit India movement led by Mahatma Gandhi, inspired by yogic principles of non-violent resistance, of truth, of ahimsa, of kindness and truth, they arbitrarily drew a line through India. And as a result of that, and because they had fermented all this divide and rule policies, during the partition, 14.5 million people were displaced and dispossessed of their land on both sides of the partition. 3.2 million people went missing, killed in sectarian violence. 83,000 women were raped and abducted and forcibly married. So this was the trauma that's been inherited by South Asian people. And never even begin to discuss the trauma inherited by Black people who were enslaved. And uprooted. 12 million Africans were uprooted from Africa, from their family, their communities, their families, their ancestral lands. So this kind of trauma in the psyche and in the DNA of Black and brown bodies comes up when we move into yoga spaces where we're asked to make ourselves vulnerable, and when we are in a practice that doesn't recognize the trauma that we bring to it, triggers this trauma, it re-traumatizes us. So this is why yoga teachers need to have trauma-informed practice and need to have anti-racist training, because then they can begin to deliver a practice that is safe for more people, rather than just safe for white people in those spaces. So my call is for more Black and brown yoga teachers, more Black and brown students to be able to have access to these yoga spaces, and for white yoga teachers to uplift, center, and elevate Black and brown voices in this industry, in this sector, and to welcome and embrace learning so that they can support Black and brown students. And, you know, we all need to see ourselves mirrored.
You did mention before that when you went to some of these yoga classes at the beginning, perhaps, of your yoga journey, that you felt like people that were giving the classes definitely didn't know the history behind of what they were talking about or sharing with their students.
What it felt like is that there were two kinds of yoga teacher that I've experienced, white yoga teachers I'm talking about here. And one of the things that I found most, so that you have one yoga teacher that is just exercise, it's just an exercise class. And so all of the asanas, all of the poses are gone through really quickly, and you can barely have time to catch your breath, and very little Sanskrit, or the philosophy, or all of the other elements of the practice are brought in to it. So you would just think it's an exercise class. And then there's another kind of teacher who tries to honor the practice by bringing in some philosophy, by bringing in some Sanskrit. But what often happens there is they end up culturally appropriating rather than appreciating. Because what they've done is, because they don't have friendships with Asian people, they don't understand the culture from the inside out. So they bring their white lens to the culture, and then they cherry pick and select what suits them, rather than holistically honoring the cultural practice and the wisdom tradition. So they end up appropriating it, and that causes harm. So what I felt was that I was being, I felt cognitive dissonance. I felt like I was being gaslighted by someone who was talking about my culture and my religion and my faith and my wisdom practice, but in a way that they were being superior to me, and they were telling me how it works, and that they were in the right and I was wrong, and my understanding of it was wrong, or that my practice.
That's really important. And it made the power balance, because, like you said, yoga is meant to be for everybody, including the communities where yoga originated from. So you said, like, you felt like basically you were learning about your culture from somebody else who hadn't gone to the depths of it to really understand it and share it.
Who wasn't born into it, who wasn't raised into it, who doesn't have friendship circles, who doesn't go to the temples, who doesn't, you know, spend time. What often happens is white yoga teachers go to India and they think that they understand South Asian culture, and then they come back here. What they don't realize, that South Asian diaspora, so all of the people who left India and South Asia after the partition and were invited to the UK or went to the US or Canada, their experience is very different to Asians in South Asia, because Asians in this country, South Asians in this country, are growing up with racism. They have, in the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, every decade, there have been race riots. There have been racist politicians. There has been anti-immigration rhetoric. We have seen go-home vans drive through Black and brown areas. We saw the anti-immigration rhetoric during Brexit. We've seen what's happened with Black Lives Matter. We see what happens with stop and searches. We see what happens when Black and brown people are, killed at the hands of the police. We know about Stephen Lawrence. We know about institutional racism in the police force. We know about institutional racism in the Home Office. And yet, when white teachers teach yoga to South Asians in this country, they do not recognize that the experience that South Asians have in this country is not the same as South Asians in India. South Asians in India are living in a country that is brown. So therefore they don't have to deal with being a minority in a country that is majority dominantly white.
What I really like about your work is that you kind of close, it's not out there anymore, the racism. You really have to kind of look into yourself, look into your communities, look into your activities and question everything. So actually I also wanted to mention that I know that you've got a lot of connection with Greenwich libraries and you love reading and books. It would be really nice just to spend a few minutes telling us about your experiences of these things.
Well, yeah. So I want to tell you the whole story because it's really, it is rooted in being a person of color, a woman of color. Yeah. When I first went to school at the age of 5, I could not speak a word of English because my parents didn't learn English. So when they came here, they worked in the iron foundries of the Black country, and we didn't speak English. So I went to school not knowing and understanding anything that was happening around me. I felt alienated. I felt isolated. I felt really alone and scared.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until this teacher started sharing picture books. And even though I couldn't understand what they were saying, I could see the pictures and I could see the story on the page. And for me, that felt like a magical moment because all of a sudden here I had a connection with this teacher and with all of the other pupils in my class through these pictures on the book. And so that's when I fell in love with books. Yeah. And I, without a doubt, when because we didn't have books in our house. My parents used to tell stories about India and the deities and the gurus, but we didn't have books in the house.
Yeah.
So we joined the library, and I used to be able to go to the library on my own and pick out books. And how I learned to read was through the library service. And I consumed and devoured all of the books that I could. I literally must have borrowed every book in the children's section. And then I moved to the adult, in those days, you didn't have a young people section. You just went from children's to adults. And I started reading all of the classics. And I was so hungry for the written word, but it opened up my place in this world. I felt that I could access Englishness. I could access living in England through these books in a way, although I assimilated and I felt like I belonged to this country, and I began to, become acculturated to Britishness and Englishness through books.
Can you share some of your favourite titles with us? Some all-time favourites?
This is really going back. So, I know that some of the picture books, and so when I joined Greenwich Libraries, because I idolised librarians. When I grew up, librarians they were my supports. They were the ones who helped me, gave me the pathway into reading.
So it's a very warm and supporting and welcoming space.
I love librarians. I think that the world they open up for children living in poverty, for children of colour, is just, the gift they give us is immense. And I absolutely adore librarians. So I naturally wanted to grow up and be a librarian. I didn't. I became a lawyer, and then I eventually became a librarian. I became the early years librarian for Greenwich Libraries, working with the Sure Start programs and then children's centres. And now that's how I progressed into working children's services.
Oh, that sounds very exciting.
It's wonderful the work that Greenwich Libraries and Greenwich Council do. I'm really proud to be an employee here in this borough and the opportunities we give our children and young people. And so when I was the books that I love, at the moment, the books I used to share with young children were all we're going on a bear hunt, Lima's Red Hot Chili Pepper,
the classic ones.
Where Spot, Dear Zoo, all of those, the little children just love all those, and those are my classic. The Very Hungry Caterpillar, those classics are always my favorite.
It doesn't matter how many times you read that one.
Now I'm responsible for the early years settings in Greenwich at the moment, and so we recently did a list of kind of books written by Black authors, picture books, and beautiful story of Solway, there's just some amazing books, and if you want to know where they are, obviously ask your librarian, but also ask at your local early years settings, because they have these amazing resources and books that I think what was missing in my childhood was seeing characters of color in books.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, and I just want to share, quickly grab a book.
Okay.
Because we're talking about
oh, love it.
yoga.
Yeah.
This is a book called Finding Om, and it's written by my friend Rashmi Bismarck, who is a South Asian yoga teacher. And as you can see, it's just beautiful. So this little Asian girl with her grandfather learning how to meditate and say "Ow."
Oh, wow.
So I highly recommend this book to everyone, please. And this is what I want. So I bought this for my goddaughter.
Kallie, I'm going to have to stop you there. I want to carry on talking all day. But I just want to say, on behalf of GLL, thank you for joining us today and for sharing all your thoughts and experiences during Black History Month. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to Greenwich Libraries and to Greenwich Council, and thank you to Poonam and all the wonderful